Hello, everyone. On behalf of Estuate and Informatica, I welcome you all to this webinar, Actionable Data Governance, How to Manage My Sensitive Data Risk. I'll be your moderator and co-presenter. Today's agenda is to introduce you to Estuate, what we do, our offerings around Informatica, focus on secure at source. We have an interesting assessment offer for you. We'll talk about that. And finally, Q&A. During the course of this webinar, if you have any questions, please feel free to post them in the Q&A section. We'll take them at the end of the session. We are trying to wrap this up in 30 to 40 minutes. So without further ado, let's begin. My name is Pankaj Shah. I manage the Informatica practice at Estuate. I come with 13+ years of experience in enterprise software and data security. Over a period of my experience, I have taken up various roles in the delivery, pre-sales, and consulting. My co-presenter, Eric Alstom, is a domain expert in the data security group at Informatica. He comes with 20+ years of experience in the enterprise software and data security. Prior to Informatica, he has worked in companies like Data Guys, Application Security, and IBM. Now, who is Estuate? So we are a global technology services company based out of Sunnyvale, California, with offices in New Jersey, London, Canada, and Bangalore. We have two separate focuses. First is the technology focus, and the other one is domain expertise, that is the industry verticals. From a technology focus area, we have 4 practices: data and analytics, product engineering services, subscription, billing and revenue management, and governance, risk and compliance. Now, as we work with the data problems of our customers to help them build scalable solutions day in and day out, we have been in a unique position to build sizable domain expertise in the industry verticals, that is healthcare and pharma, financial services, and retail and e-commerce. Now, from an Informatica standpoint, what do we do? So we are Informatica partners for the past few years, and we have been working closely with our customers to solve their data problems, right from data ingestion all the way to analytics. So we work with them to implement scalable data integration and data security product solutions. Now, today's focus is on secure at source. This is a unique solution from Informatica, which we believe will help companies who are grappling with problems around data security. For example, where is my sensitive data? What is the risk associated with it? And how do I manage this on an ongoing basis? In order to go further deep down into it, I would hand over the control to Eric, who will provide an overview on this. So over to you, Eric.
Thanks a lot, Pankil, and thanks to Estuate for inviting me onto this presentation today. And I'll see if I can move the slide forward here. Can you move it to the next slide? So before we kind of dive in, let's look at the challenge that we really, the main reason why we developed secured source here at Informatica. Here's like 4 boxes. There shouldn't be any surprise to anybody, but just to go through that as we see today, there's sensitive data everywhere in almost any organization, right? But then I also see most organization has really good data governance policies in place on paper, at least most of them. But what happens is those policies is typically only enforced on a few key systems. The ones that you know upfront really contain sensitive data, but they are not forced across the enterprise. And then, so that said, combined with if you look at the security and how it's been the last 20 years, 20 plus year, I guess, it's all been about, protecting the perimeters and, trying to limit access to the data itself. But now with cloud, with, mobile phones, etc., where is the parameters? It's really changing, and you really need to look at it in a different way. And then obviously all data cannot just be encrypted, right? So you need different mechanisms to be able to manage. So the bottom line here is really that we need today you don't really have an idea of how to prioritize sensitive data risk. And that means that it could cause you a problem, which we see in a lot of breaches that happen. So this is the challenge. This is what we're trying to solve, to really have a much better insight into sensitive data risk. So what we've done here at Informatica, we come up with a kind of a best practice model. So if we look at the next slide here, what you really need to look at is sensitive data risk. And in a couple of slides later, I would explain some of the parameters that goes into that risk calculation. But really what you need is an enterprise tool that can automate this, and really scale to an enterprise level. And it needs to be able to handle all kinds of data we see today: unstructured, structured, cloud, and and of course the traditional databases, etc. So you really need to have a framework in place to cover all those. But then you can look at it from a maturity perspective. And the first step is really to do discovery and classification. That's kind of the foundations for everything there. And we're just not saying that traditional discovery where you just locate where the sensitive data is. You really need to divide it by risk. And as I said, we're gonna talk about that in a second, what we mean with that. But step one is obviously to do that classification and so forth. Once you got that foundation in place, you can now move on to the next level, which really is about data movement. How is my sensitive data moving within the organization? So I need to capture that. And the notion here is that if I have a production system, for instance, where I'm pushing sensitive data out from that to other downstream systems, to non-production systems, etc., the more systems that it gets pushed out to, the higher risk it possesses that something goes wrong in some of those downstream systems, right? So I really need to first have a clear picture of that data movement, and then being able to calculate that into my risk score. So now I'm kind of halfway my maturity model, in the second box, and I have a pretty good foundation. Very few organizations is actually at that level today. But now, if you look at those two, that's still pretty, static. You're doing your, you go out, you scan your different data stores, you identify, you classify, you start your protection status, right? But then how much does it really change? It's not that much, perhaps. Yes, you're changing the data models here and there, and hopefully you're starting to apply more and more protection. But besides that, it's, you could argue that it's pretty static. So what you need to add next is actually looking at who have access to that sensitive data. So again, the more people that have access to sensitive data, the higher risk that somebody misplaced that data, or of course, maybe somebody even take advantage of it. So that's the next step here, is to now looking at the user access, is people actually using that access, and so forth. And then finally on the second box is now I also need to include user activity, who is taking advantage of their user rights and who is actually accessing sensitive data. Now it becomes a very dynamic model, right? Now I really need to look at, what's going on, my security team obviously would sit and look and it's looking for, you know, things that look strange and anomalies, etc. But, you know, so far, if I implement that, and that's what some organizations have done for some of their key systems, you know, their security team spends a lot of times going through logs and alerts, and, you know, maybe most of that is false positives, right? So they're chasing their tail, trying to get on top of it. So what you really need to do as the final step in this maturity model is having an anomaly detection module that basically helps you identify where you should be looking. Where is the anomalies happening, or where's the needle in the haystack? You know, that is really what we strive to get to that place. So this is basically the model we put in place, and then as I go through the secured source, I will kind of try to map it out to these 3 boxes and what kind of functionality we have. But we've been talking about risk, so let's just, you know, identify a little bit more what we mean when we talk about sensitive data risk. You know, so as you see here, risk as obviously is the potential of losing something of value. So we have kind of said sensitive data risk is the potential impact of losing sensitive data. So that's kind of our definition. And then there's a common misperceptions out there that, you know, sensitive data risk equals the location of data. It's not true, because if you think about most of the discovery tool classification tools out there, the output that they're going to give you is something like this. It will tell you that data store A, that you, for instance, have, you know, 15 columns with names in, 20 with addresses, 5 with phone numbers, 2 with social security number. Then you have database B that has 5 fields with SSN, 1 credit card field, and maybe, you know, 15 columns with names. But how do you compare those 2 against each other? And how do you know which one is the riskiest? And the idea here is that, yes, ideally, I know I need to protect everything across my enterprise, but guess what? We have constraints, other financial, resource constraints, etc. So I need to have a risk score that tells me where should I start. And then as I'm progressing, I want to understand, you know, that I want to see the risk score go down, and I want to see that now new data stores is the top of my risk scale there. So that's really what we are looking for. And in order to do that, we need to have multiple factors to calculate a risk score. So let's look at what we have determined needs to be part of the risk scoring and what we have today in secured source. So obviously, the first step here is to define what do I mean with sensitive data, what data domains, as we call them here in Informatica. Other people would say, you know, sensitive data elements. So, you know, it could be a social security number, it could be a phone number, it could be, you know, driver license, etc. So we need to define that, and obviously there should be a lot of out-of-the-box elements, but then each organization may have their own elements they want to define. Could be a policy number, an account number, things like that they deem to be sensitive. So that I need to define first. I then need to understand where I had that data in the environment. But talking about sensitive data elements, in my eyes, they are not born equal. So if you look at a social security number versus a name or a phone number, you know, there's different risk levels to it. But you also need to look at combinations of data. So to give you a simple example, if you look at a credit card number by itself, is that all you have? Some would say that has some risk, some would say no, but you know, it's definitely a low risk to begin with. But what if I have a credit card number, a name, and a zip code? Then, you know, it becomes much more risky, and actually I have enough information that I could use it on a gas station anywhere here in California, for instance. So I need to be able to build policy where I look at combinations of data and assign different values to it and different risk levels. And then once I have this built, the policies and my definitions of my policies, my sensitive elements, I obviously go out and find it in the environment. And then I also need to capture, for instance, how much data do I have? Do I just have, 100 rows, or do I have, 1,000,000 rows? That's going to make an impact there. And then finally, not finally, but the next step here is I also need to understand, as I'm looking at a data store, a file or a Hadoop, is that data already protected? Did I encrypt that data? Did I mask it, or did I protect it another way? That should, if that's the case, then the risk should go way, way down. So I need a vehicle to be able to capture that information. And then, as we talked about, the user access and who have access to it and who is accessing it, that should definitely calculate into the overall risk score. So those are the factors we're talking about when we are talking about sensitive data risk. All right, so let me go to the next slide here. Pankil, you probably need to move it. For some reason, I can't move it. So now let's talk specifically about Informatica and how secured source fits to the overall best practices framework we put in place. So first of all, here's the definition of what is secured source. So as you can read, it's a unified platform to identify, analyzing, and ranking sensitive data risk. This is the definition of secured source. So now that said, let's go to the next slide and look at how we now map out to the 3 boxes we talked about earlier. So here we got the sensitive data visibility. So obviously we have an agentless scan across the data stores we talked about, where we have a sophisticated policy framework you can put in place to really build not only discovery policy, but also classification policies. You can even assign a value to the different policies. So you can, kind of come up with a number. What would be my potential cost if I lost, every row or X number of rows from a data store, for instance? So we can go out, we can set up scans. Obviously, you can do full scan, sampling, etc. But then we also have an integration to our own masking tools. So we can actually scan our own masking repository and see, all right, these columns and files has been protected. So obviously that would calculate into the risk score. And then we also provide a way for importing third-party protection, as we talked about. If you're using, another masking tool, or if you're having an encryption tool, you can import for instance, the columns that's been encrypted. So we know that, and that will then, drive down the risk score. And the whole idea behind secured source is that it's highly graphical. So it's a lot of different dashboards and widgets. So you can look at data in many different ways. You can look at the top data stores, the top department, and everything we show is actually based on the risk score. So I can look, when I say the top data stores, it will be the riskiest data stores I will see from the highest going down. And the idea here is that initially that should drive your protection effort, right? You should go through that list and saying, all right, my top data store is actually, since that has the highest risk, there's a high probability that I didn't protect anything or very few things in that data store. So now let me go there and then, move forward to the next one and next one. So that will help you kind of guide you through the big questions everybody has. Where should I start? Right? Then you could also look at secured source as becoming a communication platform. So if you think about it today, in many organizations, the governance team is setting the high-level policies. Then the security teams now take the high-level policies and make it into some actionable policies. And then when it comes to protection, they typically hand that off to the operation teams that will now go in and apply encryption, masking, etc. So you've got 3 different teams that maybe not necessarily on the same page. Right hand don't know what left hand's doing. So they maybe assume that certain data stores has been protected, but how do they really know unless there's a nice feedback loop? So within secured source, now you have a common framework for policies that the three teams can share, and then you could go in and you could actually either look at it from a data store perspective, but you could see, did we make progress? Did we actually lower the overall risk score at the enterprise level? Did we do it at the individual data store level or the department level? And then, I can dive in and see exactly what happened. So that's what I mean with this can become a communication vehicle that, you can share across multiple groups to get them all on the same page. So with that said, let's go here to the next slide now. So now we got the framework in place, we got the risk ranking, etc. I now need to look at data movement, and ideally I could get it start that up front. Some may want to wait with it, but really with the data movement, we today have multiple ways to get that data in here. Again, we have an integration to our own ETL tool, to Microsoft ETL tool. In the upcoming release, there'll be integrations to other ETL tools as well. So the idea is that we can go and scan the repositories for these ETL tools and capture all data movement. And obviously, as we move that into secured source, we're only interested in data movement around sensitive data. So that would be all that will be left behind here in secured source is that, for instance, SSN was moving from one data store to the other. But if you look at the top picture, that this is how we graphically will show you the data movement. And then the red color basically shows you that those are fields, sensitive fields that's not protected. The green shows that some fields has been protected. So now if I'm looking at that, I see two data stores in there that's 100% red. So I could click on any of those and see what sensitive data is coming in here, and exactly what columns is sitting there unprotected. So I could now, fire off either a notification or an alert to my operations team saying, hey, you need to protect this. So quickly it gives you an insight, graphically to where you should, have some issues that you should look at. So that's the proliferation, as we call it, or data movement. Then we obviously have user activity that we can ingest as well. And let me be clear, today in secured source, we do not capture the user activity in the different data stores. You would have to either have a database, for instance, database activity monitoring tool in place where you can push that information into our syslog server, or you could, for instance, enable native audit logging from on the database itself, and we could then push that data into secured source. But for Hadoop, for instance, we have an out-of-the-box integration with Navigator and other tools that capture data movement. But again, it's a third-party tool that can push that information into secured source. And again, the same principle here, that as data gets served into us, we are collating it for sensitive data, if somebody accessing that, and that's all we are keeping. So somebody may be lazy and saying, I'm just going to send all the information to secured source, and then we will go through all the activities and delete all the activities that don't relate sensitive data and keep it back. So then the idea here is that I can look at who's my top users, etc. But even though secured source looks fantastic and has, it's a nice UI to look at, we don't expect anybody spending too much time sitting and watching the dashboard all the time. So you obviously want to manage by exception, which is common in security, right? So we have a framework where you can build a lot of different alerts that can either go through email to point you to certain things. It can actually be scripting that you do in the background, with user management, etc. And one of the things you could do, for instance, is set up a rule saying if somebody is moving data from a production system to a non-production system, and if that data is not protected, I want to know about it. And that's something that one of our customers, that was where their key use cases. They had a lot of databases with a lot of sensitive information in. They had all the masking tools in place they needed to mask their non-production, but they had some they were suspicious about, was that tool actually used? So, we went in there, we connected to our masking tool, we connected to the ETL tool, we saw the data movement, we could see that data was actually not protected everywhere. So we had alerts coming up on our dashboards that you could go in and saying there was at least 10 data stores where they didn't do the masking. So obviously that raised the hell in the organization and really helped us solidify the tool and the investment they did in it, because now they had, full insights to what was going on all sides of the process. All right, so then, as we talked about, at this level here, looking at all the user activities, and I can obviously see who is touching sensitive data, what's the SQL statement, where was it run from, and the tool, etc. But again, that's a lot of work that some of your security folks are already doing today, and they don't want another tool to try to look for the same thing. So that's why we need to go to the final slide here and talk about anomaly detection. Because you want the system to tell you where to look for the needle in the haystack. So what we have built is a set of machine learning and AI algorithms to really look at all the ingest. And what we really do is we look at you as an individual user, we compare you to the users within the same user group and trying to understand what's normal behavior for you. So the way it works is that as you start it up, you put it in for 2 to 4 weeks in a learning mode, where it's simply just observe what's going on, trying to make sense of what you're doing and what your peers are doing. And then once you start enabling it, it can then start doing anomaly detection. And anomalies could be, for instance, if I never have accessed a certain system, that would be an easy one, low, right? Suddenly I'm accessing a new system. But what it also look at, what is the typical volume of data I'm getting out? So I'm always accessing certain, let's say an HR system, and my queries typically get 100 to 500 rows every time. Suddenly now I'm making a query that get 1 million rows down. I mean, that would be an anomaly. It could also be combinations of sensitive elements. So I'm typically only doing 2-3 elements, queries with that. Suddenly I'm doing a staff all from the table, getting, all the sensitive element at one point. So there's 5-6 different parameters we're really looking at, and we could do the alerting on it. But not only can we do alerting, we could also do some scripting in the back end. And here it comes in really handy. Think about this scenario. You got somebody from the outside sending in an email with a link in. Somebody in the organization, by mistake, click on that link and boom, now you have an intruder that has your credentials. So now that intruder starts poking around, probably easy in the beginning, starting to, download some data. Eventually they get into sensitive data and they start small perhaps, and then they go bigger. At some point during this scenario, the anomaly detection clicks in, and it maybe hit one of the rules you built where you can say, hey, if this condition happened, I want to move that user out of the current LDAP group where that user have access to sensitive data, put that user into a user group with no access to sensitive data, while the security team investigate what's going on. So what I'm saying here is that we could not, stop an attack, but we can minimize the impact of an attack. So maybe if they only get, a couple of 100 rows, or maybe it's a couple of 1,000 rows of sensitive data versus millions of rows. And really, again, when it comes to anomalies, you can also see who's my highest risk users, who is doing strange things. And that obviously should be a dynamic, so at any time you can kind of look at that list and making sure that it's okay. I'm going to look at my top anomalies across the enterprise, but then I can also see what data stores have, you know, most anomalies against them. Perhaps somebody is really trying to spoof a specific system and trying to get access there or doing things that they were not supposed to. So that way I can look at it. So that's at a high level, the secured source and the framework that we think you need to have in place to really manage your sensitive data risk. So with that said, let me hand it back over to you, Pankil.
Sure. Thank you, Eric, for this excellent overview. Now, we at Estuate are very confident about the capabilities of Secured Source. So as I mentioned earlier, we have a exclusive assessment offer for existing Power Center customers. What this assessment offer is all about is if you agree to give us your Power Center repository logs, we can analyze those using Secured Source and provide you a risk assessment. This assessment generally takes 3 to 5 days, but we are going to offer it to you free of cost. Now, what does this assessment generally take? What is the plan? So generally what we do is we receive the repository logs from you, we configure the application to analyze this, and then once we get the results, we basically share it with you, we go over them with you. Now in that assessment results session, we go over the background of the assessment, what we found from the repository logs, and then give you an overview of the solution and a demo, and then discuss the next steps. We think that this is a very unique offer that would be very helpful for you in your data journey and to understand where your data security programs are and how to take them forward. So we look forward to you to engage with us and take this offer up and work with us, and we are sure to help you out in this. With this, I would like to thank you once again for participating in this webinar and open up the floor for any questions. Okay, so we do have 3 questions in the question box. So the first question is, what type of sources does Secured Source support? So,
all right, so let me cover that quickly. So I would talk about what we have today in the current release, which is 3.0, and then I would give you an insight into our upcoming 4.0 release that's coming out here in August. So in the current release, we support, I would say, most databases. You know, most of them we have a direct connection out of the box. Some of them it would have to go through JDBC driver. Most structured data is supported. Then we have support for Salesforce. We have support for semi-structured data in Hadoop. And then we have support for Hive as well. That's what we have in today's release that's available. In the upcoming release 4.0, as I said, in August, we would add to that, we would add support for unstructured data. So traditional PDF, Microsoft files, so Word, Excel, etc., text files, log files on Windows and Linux or drives. We would also be able to connect to on-prem SharePoint at this point. And then we've added a slew of cloud data stores, so Redshift, Azure, Microsoft Azure in the cloud, and some others. So we're really expanding the footprint to cover what I was trying to say initially, what one tool should cover it all.
Okay, Okay, thank you, Eric. The next question is, how is the risk calculated?
So the risk score today is calculated. It's a mathematical formula based on 8 different parameters, and you can actually, within the tool itself, you can slide each parameter from 0 to 100 to indicate how big a factor it is in the calculation itself. So those factors is, the sensitivity level or the classification level, the number of rows, number of sensitive elements, the cost of a row, so the risk cost, and then it also includes user access, how many people have access to it, and then how many people is actually accessing it. So all that is get mixed in some patent calculation to come out with the risk in the end.
Okay. Question number 3 is, once we find the sensitive data and mask it using third-party tool, how would Securate Source know that the data is masked in the second run?
So, I mean, the easiest way is basically to import in the, you can actually give us, for instance, if it's a database that you're masking, if we get the tables that's been masked, you can import that in. So we have a special, CSV format that you can send to us, then we would know about it. So that would be the best to make sure you do it. And part of doing the import, you can also describe what tool was used. But so that's if you just did it, and followed the way you should do it. But let's say that you mask the data. Another way you can detect if data is masked is actually something I realized with a customer yesterday, that we looked at the metadata and realized there was a lot of columns that had sensitive data according to the definition. So there was SSN columns, etc. Then when we did a data scan, we realized that they didn't pop up because they had, SSN was X'd out. So they didn't replace the data with the real looking data. They were basically Xing out values. So suddenly when we did a data scan, we could see that all those sensitive columns disappeared. So you could use that as an indicator to see if data was masked. But obviously, if you're doing best practices and you're replacing a social security number with a fake social security number, there would be no way we could detect that except you had to import in that information.
Okay. The next one is, do I have to be a Power Center customer to use Securate Source? I mean, I don't.
No.
So.
No, you do not have to be a Power Center customer. It gives you some. Today, it gives you some advantages that we can capture data movement automatically. But as I said in the next release, we were actually opening up for the other ETL tools, so you get the same advantage regardless of what ETL tool you're using.
Okay. So the next question is, what is the minimum RAM required to install Securate Source?
Yeah, that's a tricky question. I think that's a trick question, right? So that really depends. How many data stores do you expect to scan? How many do you want to run in parallel and so on? So the minimum configuration for Securate Source is actually 2 boxes, because you have the application server and then we have a Hadoop cluster. And the way you're scaling out is adding more and more nodes to your Hadoop cluster. So it really depends, what minimum is, and it's really based on what you intend, how much you intend to scan and how much you want in parallel.
Okay. And I think the final question in the Q&A is what is the competitive advantage of Securate Source when compared to other discovery tools in the market?
No, so I said that all the other discovery tools in the market gives you, most of them don't give you a a risk score at all, right? They just give you the location of the sensitive data. Some of them has a very simplistic, risk scoring model. So that's one thing. The other thing is that we believe that the framework we have to build sophisticated policies and classification obviously have, some advantages over most tools out there. And then the ability to ingest, as we talked about, user activity, the ability to ingest protection status as well. It really gives you a platform to truly understand what's my current risk and where I'm headed, am I making progress, etc., which you typically cannot do in any of the other tools out there.
Okay. That's all the questions I had logged in the Q&A. Any other questions from the existing participants? All right. I think then we can. I think we have come to a end of this webinar. I hope you all have found it to be useful, and we look forward to engaging with you on your data journey as you move forward in the data security domain space or a data integration side of it. But I would like to thank Eric for helping us out with this presentation, and with that, I would close this webinar. Thank you all.
Thanks. I appreciate everybody's time today. Thanks for listening in.